Nowadays, following hygiene rules has become second nature. From early childhood, we're taught to wash our hands and brush our teeth. We know very well, and the COVID-19 pandemic reminded us once again that our survival depends on these simple habits. Yet, it took many centuries and countless epidemics before humanity finally understood this basic truth. In this episode, we'll explore the history of hygiene. You'll learn how many bathhouses existed in ancient Rome and how many public baths operated in medieval Paris. We'll look at the role of the sanitary police in ancient Greece. Is it really true that Louis XIV bathed only 3 times in his entire life? Was the so-called unwashed Middle Ages truly as dirty as we imagine? And why could a love for beer sometimes mean the difference between life and death? The very first attempts at hygiene comes from Hygeia, the ancient Greek goddess of health and daughter of Asclepius, the god of medicine. She was often depicted as a young woman offering a serpent a drink from a bowl. Over time, these attributes, the bowl and the snake, became lasting symbols of medicine. The very first attempts at hygiene, though the concept itself didn't exist yet, go back to prehistoric people. Learning from bitter experience, they sought out clean sources of water. With the discovery of fire, they began to cook food, which not only made it easier to digest, but also disinfected it. The ancient Chinese took these practices much further. According to Herodotus, they washed their dishes daily and wore freshly laundered clothes, and this wasn't limited to the upper classes. Priests set the example. They bathed 4 times a day and shaved their heads every 3 days. Interestingly, it's believed that the Greek goddess Hygeia may have been inspired by the Egyptian god of magic, Heka. He, too, was linked with medicine and was often depicted with 2 coiling snakes. The ancient Greeks carried on developing a bathing culture. Every aristocrat's household typically had a small pool in the courtyard where daily baths were customary. Sometimes people would add fragrances, oils, and flower petals to the water. Aromatic substances were also burned indoors to disinfect the air. Ancient Greece even had a kind of sanitary police, tasked with monitoring the sale of food and drinks to protect citizens from poisoning. The Romans later expanded on these practices, turning bathing into a true cultural phenomenon. Their thermae, massive bathhouse complexes with pools, were nothing short of architectural marvels. Near natural springs, they constructed multi-story buildings that could host thousands of visitors at once. Inside, there were dressing rooms, toilets, pools of different temperatures, massage rooms, and steam chambers with dry heat, the forerunners of today's saunas. The thermae were open to everyone, regardless of gender or social class. At the height of imperial Rome, the city boasted around 170 bathhouses, some of which even included theaters and brothels. Romans also cared deeply about public cleanliness. They built aqueducts everywhere for water supply and dug drainage channels to remove waste.
But then came the Middle Ages, which, as we've all heard, supposedly brought hygiene not just to a halt, but into a steep decline. Or did it, really? It's often said that Queen Isabella of Castile bathed only twice in her lifetime, and that the Sun King, Louis XIV, was terrified of water. Yet these claims are questionable. After all, Louis XIV had his own luxurious bath apartments with 3 separate rooms. And Spain, heavily influenced by Muslim culture, actually had fewer hygiene issues than most of Europe.
The internet is full of myths about hygiene in the Middle Ages and even later times, so we simply have to clear things up. Let's dive in. Let's start with bathhouses. It's true that their numbers declined after the fall of the Roman Empire, but they didn't disappear entirely. In Paris, for example, where the population in the 13th century was under 100,000, there were 26 public baths in operation. In Vienna, there were 29, and the prices were fairly affordable. Stories about the unwashed Middle Ages often mention the church, which supposedly forbade people from bathing, claiming it would wash away the holy water poured over children at baptism. But that's just another myth. Yes, the church wasn't too fond of public bathhouses, but for an entirely different reason. They were notorious hotspots for vice and immorality. Plenty of documents shed light on the reality. Bathing was mandatory for all monks, and the sick, whom the church often cared for, were provided with special bathing facilities. But the decisive factor that puts the myths to rest is soap. Soap had been invented long before our era, but in medieval times its production only kept growing. By the 1370s, for instance, one of the wealthiest industrialists in Marseille, Davin Crescus, made his fortune as a soap maker. After all, why produce and sell tons of soap if no one was washing or doing laundry? So, let's take a closer look at a few more popular myths about hygiene in the past. Myth number 1. Medieval doctors claimed that bathing was dangerous to one's health, so people supposedly avoided it and only wiped themselves down instead. There's a grain of truth here. Official medicine at the time did believe that water softened the body, opened up the pores, and allowed harmful substances from the outside to seep into the skin. That's why frequent bathing was often discouraged. But those very same doctors insisted on washing the hands, face, and feet regularly, and on rinsing one's hands before meals. Myth number 2. Beautiful teeth were supposedly seen as a sign of low birth, so respectable ladies actually tried to make their teeth look as bad as possible. Even saying it out loud sounds absurd. In reality, oral hygiene at the time was fairly well developed. Doctors recommended rinsing the mouth with water after every meal and chewing fragrant herbs to get rid of bad breath. People also cleaned their teeth, first with wooden sticks, and by the 18th century, actual toothbrushes had started to appear. Myth number 3. Kings and queens hardly ever bathed. This is probably the most widespread myth, and no one has suffered from it more than poor Louis XIV. It's often claimed that he hated bathing so much he only took 3 baths in his entire life. Well, it's time to set the record straight.
Take, for example, the French King Francis I. His palace at Fontainebleau had a luxurious bathing suite with several rooms. Rudolph I of Habsburg, King of Germany, even built bathhouses for his soldiers during wartime sieges, since no commander wanted an epidemic breaking out in the middle of a campaign. And if he took the trouble to wash his soldiers, you can bet he bathed himself, too. There are plenty of other examples. After the Battle of Granson in 1476, the Swiss found a silver-plated bathtub in the abandoned camp of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, which he carried with him on military campaigns. And as for Louis XIV, according to the Duke of St. Simon, the king's body was rubbed each morning with rose-scented lotion, then dried with towels before his shirt was changed. Servants washed his hands and feet with a mix of wine and water. Louis changed outfits 3 or 4 times a day, and each time his body was rubbed from head to toe with rose or lavender spirit. By the standards of his age, he was one of the cleanest men alive. And yes, he did bathe. He had his own bathing apartments consisting of 3 rooms.
Myth number 4. Versailles reeked of filth. And yes, it did smell, but not in the way you might imagine. Bodily odors were considered extremely bad manners at Versailles, so aristocrats drenched themselves from head to toe in perfume. In fact, the heavy cloud of fragrances from hundreds of courtiers was enough to make someone faint. Among French nobles, it was customary to rub down daily with alcohol-based scented lotions. Those who couldn't afford them would wipe themselves with a damp cloth instead. Bathing was often done in sections, since not everyone had access to a proper bath, so water was drawn into buckets or basins. Another key marker of cleanliness was the whiteness of one's linen. It was expected that undergarments be changed at least once a day. Fine white linen was so expensive that people proudly showed it off, letting spotless shirt cuffs peek out as a symbol of wealth and refinement.
Myth number 5. Aristocrats were plagued by fleas. And this one is no myth. Countless elaborate contraptions were invented to catch them, worn under clothing, hung around the neck, tucked under wigs, or placed beside the bed at night. These flea catchers usually looked like small bottles with a screw-on lid. Inside, people placed a bit of cloth soaked in honey or resin to trap the insects. So yes, hygiene problems certainly existed in the Middle Ages, but they weren't nearly as catastrophic as the legends make them out to be. So where did all these myths come from? Think of them as propaganda. During the early modern period, writers often painted the Middle Ages as a dark age to make their own Enlightenment era shine brighter by comparison. Ironically, hygiene in those so-called enlightened times was far from ideal. For instance, frequent washing of the genitals was believed to cause infertility in women, and during menstruation, there were no hygiene products beyond scraps of cloth. But that wasn't the worst of it. Far more tragic was the fact that thousands of women died in childbirth from blood poisoning. Doctors would often go straight from dissecting a corpse to delivering a baby without washing their hands. It wasn't until the second half of the 19th century that Hungarian obstetrician Ignaz Semmelweis made the connection between dirty hands and infection, insisting that physicians use antiseptics. Around the same time, scientists began to understand the link between bacteria and infectious diseases.
A turning point came during the cholera outbreak in London in 1854, which claimed over 600 lives in a single neighborhood. At the time, people believed cholera was spread through bad air. But Dr. John Snow, yes, you heard that right, John Snow, doubted this. He conducted his own investigation and suspected that the source of the disease was the water consumed by local residents. Snow discovered that the only people not affected by cholera were workers at a nearby brewery. They avoided the neighborhood water pump because they preferred the beer, which the brewery owner provided for free. Snow mapped the cases of infection and compared them with the water sources used by the two local water companies. In the end, he identified a contaminated water pump. Once it was closed, the outbreak subsided. This case became a cornerstone for the development of epidemiology and also drove improvements in water supply and sewage systems. They say that all rules are written in blood, and hygiene is no exception. To grasp concepts that seem obvious to us today, humanity had to endure countless trials and tragedies, finally establishing basic hygiene practices by the early 20th century. Don't forget to wash your hands, and of course, subscribe to our channel and like this video.